In hospice, the room often grows very quiet near the end. Not an empty kind of quiet, but a full one. The kind that holds memories, unfinished sentences, and the gentle rhythm of someone's last breaths. I've learned that in those moments, words matter less than presence. Sometimes just sitting beside someone is the greatest gift you can offer. I remember one patient who smiled in their final hour. It wasn't a big smile, it wasn't forced or brave, it was soft, steady, you know, almost knowing. The kind of smile that doesn't come from denial, but from understanding. The monitors were humming softly, the lights were dim, a loved one was holding their hand. And in that stillness, there was something unspoken passing through the room, something peaceful. Over the years, I've seen fear. I've seen regret. I've seen people reach for one more day, but every now and then I witness something different, a quiet acceptance, a gentle clarity, as if in the final stretch of life, the noise falls away and only the truth remains. That smile wasn't about pretending everything was perfect. It was about knowing what truly mattered and letting the rest go. In hospice, the end of life can be a mirror. It reflects back what we carried, what we loved, and what we finally understand when there's nothing left to prove. And sometimes in that final hour, a person smiles not because they are leaving, but because they finally see. In hospice, there is a kind of quiet that only shows up in the last hours of a life. It's not the same quiet you hear early in the morning before the world wakes up. It's heavier, but softer at the same time. It carries meaning. The machines hum in the background, the lights are dimmed low, footsteps in the hallway slow down without anyone saying they should. Even time feels different. It stretches out like it's trying to be gentle. I remember sitting beside a patient during that kind of quiet. Their breathing had changed that afternoon, slower with longer pauses in between. The body was doing what bodies do when they're getting ready to let go. There's a rhythm to it that you learn to recognize in hospice. It's not something you can rush or stop. You can only witness it. Family had been in and out of the room all day. Some cried openly, and some stood near the window and stared outside like they were waiting for something to make sense. One person held the patient's hand almost the entire time, whispering stories from years ago. Small stories, the kind about burned dinners and road trips and inside jokes that don't sound like much to anyone else, but in that room, they were everything. As the evening settled in, the room grew calmer. The conversations faded. The crying softened. There was less urgency. It's something I've seen before when people realize that there is nothing left to fix, nothing left to organize, nothing left to control. Something inside them begins to slow down too. And then in that final hour, the patient smiled. It wasn't dramatic. There were no grand speeches, no sudden bursts of energy, just a slow, gentle lifting at the corners of the mouth. Their eyes were mostly closed, but not tightly, relaxed, peaceful, the kind of expression you see when someone feels safe. That's the moment that stays with me, because earlier that week, fear had been present, not loud, but there, in the questions, in the searching looks, in the way their hand would grip mine just a little tighter when the pain flared, or when the room felt too empty. Fear is normal. It doesn't mean someone is weak. It just means they're human. But in that final hour, something shifted. I've learned over the years that fear often fades when a person feels truly seen and not alone. Not just surrounded by bodies, but genuinely seen, known, understood. There is a difference. Being seen at the end of life doesn't mean everyone agrees with your choices. It doesn't mean everyone agrees with your choices. It doesn't mean everyone agrees with, it means someone is sitting there with you, not trying to change the moment, not trying to force hope or positivity, just being present. That patient had that presence. Earlier that day, one of their loved ones leaned close and said, "It's okay, we're right here." And I watched the patient's breathing soften after those words. Not because they were magical, but because they were honest. There was no pretending that everything would go back to normal. No promises that couldn't be kept. Just a simple reassurance. You are not alone in this. In hospice, loneliness can be louder than pain. I've seen patients who weren't afraid of dying, but terrified of being forgotten. Terrified of leaving without knowing they mattered. Sometimes they don't say it directly. It shows up in questions like, did I do enough? Or will they be okay? Or even, will anyone remember that story about the lake? Underneath those questions is a deeper one. Did my life count? When someone sits beside them and answers that question, not with grand speeches, but with quiet truth, you can feel the room change. When a daughter says, "You were always there for me," or a friend says, "You changed my life," Something settles inside the person in the bed. Their shoulders drop a little, their brow smooths, the body relaxes in a way that medicine alone can't create. That patient had heard those words. I watched as each family member took a turn, leaning in close. They didn't speak loudly, they didn't need to. They told small truths. Thank you for teaching me patience. I'll take care of mom. I'll keep your garden going. Ordinary promises, but in that room, they felt sacred. The smile came after those moments. It wasn't about denial. It wasn't someone pretending they weren't dying. The body was tired. The breathing was labored. There was no confusion about what was happening. The smile felt like recognition, like understanding. In those final hours, people often become very clear about what matters. The noise of the outside world fades. The deadlines, the arguments, the unfinished projects, they lose their sharp edges. What remains are faces, hands being held, familiar voices, the feeling of belonging somewhere. I've seen patients who were estranged from family for years soften when reconciliation finally happens. I've seen people who spent decades chasing achievement whisper that they wish they had spent more time at the dinner table. I've seen people apologize for things they carried quietly for 40 years, and I've seen others say with surprising certainty, it was enough. That smile told me this patient felt it was enough. Not perfect, not flawless, but enough. There is something deeply human about wanting reassurance at the end. We want to know that our existence left a mark, even if it was small. That someone's life is different because we were here. That our love, however imperfect, reached someone. When that reassurance comes, the body sometimes responds before the mind does. The jaw unclenches, the hands stop gripping the sheets, the breath finds a softer rhythm. I've watched it happen too many times to dismiss it as coincidence. Presence has power. In hospice, we can manage pain, we can adjust medications, we can create comfort in physical ways, but there is another kind of comfort that doesn't come in a syringe. It comes in the form of a steady chair pulled close to the bed, a hand that doesn't pull away, a voice that says, I'm here and means it. That patient had that steady presence. Even when the room emptied briefly, someone always came back. No long stretches of isolation. No silent hours where the only companion was the hum of equipment. There was always a heartbeat nearby, always a reminder that they were part of something larger than that hospital bed. In the final hour, the patient opened their eyes just slightly, not wide, just enough to see the shapes around them. The person holding their hand leaned in closer. There were tears, but there was also calm, a quiet acceptance. And then that soft smile again. I've thought about that moment many times. What did they know? I don't believe they suddenly understood some grand mystery of the universe. Hospice has taught me that the realizations at the end are usually simple, stripped down, clear. They knew they were loved. They knew they were loved. They knew they weren't facing the unknown alone. They knew the people in that room would carry them forward in stories and habits and small daily rituals. Sometimes that is enough to quiet fear. The body may still struggle, the breath may still be uneven, but the spirit, whatever you believe that to be, often becomes lighter when the weight of isolation is lifted. There's a tenderness in those last hours that's hard to explain unless you've sat in that chair. You begin to notice details you might otherwise miss. The way someone's thumb moves slightly against the back of a loved one's hand. The way a tear falls but the grip doesn't loosen. The way silence becomes less frightening and more like shared understanding. That patient didn't speak in the final hour. Words had grown too heavy, but communication doesn't end when speech does. It changes form. The smile was communication. It said, I feel you here. It said, I'm not afraid right now. It said, thank you. There's something sacred about being allowed to witness that. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's real, raw, unfiltered. I've sat with patients who fought until their last breath, tense, restless, searching. And I've sat with others who seem to drift almost as if they were stepping into a familiar room. The difference often isn't about the disease or the age or the circumstances. It's about connection. When someone feels unfinished in their relationships, the body can hold on to that tension. When someone feels abandoned, even unintentionally, it can show up in agitation. But when someone feels surrounded by steady love, something softens. That evening, the lights were dim. The hallway outside was quiet. The world kept moving somewhere beyond those walls. But inside that room, everything slowed to match the rhythm of one person's breath. The smile came one last time, faint but visible. And in that expression, there was no panic. No pleading, just a gentle release of something that had been held tightly for a long time. I've learned that in the final hour, fear doesn't always disappear because death becomes less real. It fades because love becomes more real, more present, more undeniable. When a person feels truly seen, when their life has been reflected back to them in the eyes of others, they don't have to carry the question of their worth anymore. It has already been answered. That patient knew they had been seen, not for their job title, not for their mistakes, not for the roles they played in public, but for the quiet, every ways they showed up for others. And when that recognition settles in, the body sometimes responds with the smallest, most honest gesture it can manage. I've noticed that as life narrows down to its final days, something else becomes very clear. The things that once felt urgent begin to lose their shape. Titles, achievements, bank accounts, unfinished to-do lists, they don't disappear, but they grow quiet. They no longer sit at the center of the room. What moves to the center instead is love. I have sat beside people who built businesses from nothing, people who carried responsibility on their shoulders for decades, people who were known, respected, admired, and in their final days, they rarely speak about the awards on the wall or the milestones they reached. Instead, they ask about their children. They ask if their partner has eaten. They worry about whether their brother knows they were forgiven. It's not that success was meaningless. It's that it no longer feels like the measure of a life. In hospice, when someone senses time is short, conversations become more honest. There isn't the same energy for pretending. I've heard patients whisper, "I wish I had worked less," or "I wish I had said I love you more." Not with bitterness, but with clarity. A soft understanding that the heart keeps better records than the world does. That patient who smiled in their final hour had lived a full life by most standards. There were stories of hard work, stories of sacrifice, stories of long days and late nights. But in that room, none of those stories were the ones that mattered most. The stories that filled the air were about small things: teaching a child to ride a bike, dancing in the kitchen, sitting on the porch during summer storms. The love in those memories felt alive. As the body weakens, the heart often becomes more open. I've seen people who were guarded their entire lives suddenly become tender. I've watched strong, stoic individuals reach for a hand and not let go. It's as if the layers we build to protect ourselves slowly fall away when we realize we don't need them anymore. Near the end, regret sometimes surfaces. Not dramatic regret, but gentle reflections. I should have called more. I shouldn't have stayed angry that long. But even then, love usually rises above it. Families gather. Old misunderstandings soften. Words that were held back for years are finally spoken. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry. Thank you. I love you. Those words carry more weight than any trophy ever could. I remember once asking a patient what they were thinking about during a quiet moment. Their breathing was shallow, their eyes half closed. After a pause, they said, "Just faces." I asked what they meant, and they replied, "The faces I love, that was it. Not places, not possessions. Faces." Love becomes very simple at the end. It's the warmth of someone sitting close enough that you can feel their body heat. It's the sound of a familiar laugh, even through tears. It's the comfort of knowing that your absence will matter to someone, that your presence mattered while you were here. That patient smile wasn't about accomplishments. It wasn't about thinking, "I did everything perfectly." It felt like a recognition of connection. The people in that room were not there out of obligation. They were there because of shared history, shared love. There's a certain peace that comes when someone realizes they are woven into other people's lives, that their love didn't disappear into empty space. It landed somewhere. It grew somewhere. I've seen patients reach a point where they stop asking about medical details. They no longer want to know numbers or timelines. Instead, they ask, "Is everyone okay?" That question carries so much. It tells me they understand that the body is letting go, but their love is still active, still concerned, still reaching outward. When someone realizes that love is what remains, their fear often shifts. Death may still be unknown, but love feels certain. It has already proven itself. It is sitting in the room, holding their hand. I once watched a father use the last of his strength to squeeze his daughter's fingers when she said, "We'll be okay." He couldn't speak, but his eyes filled with tears. In that moment, there was an exchange, a release. He didn't need to build anything else or achieve anything else. The love between them was enough. The patient who smiled seemed to rest in that same understanding. The room was full, but it didn't feel crowded. It felt held. It felt held. Each person present carried a piece of the patient's story, and in return, the patient carried pieces of theirs. That's what love does. It threads lives together so tightly that even death cannot fully untangle them. Near the end, people don't usually ask to see their certificates or bank statements. They ask for their spouse, their son, their sister, their best friend. Or sometimes they ask for forgiveness. They want to clear space in their heart so that what remains is lighter. I've learned that love doesn't need to be perfect to be powerful. Even messy, complicated love has weight. Even relationships that struggled to can hold tenderness at the end. There is something about the closeness of death that strips away pride. What remains is vulnerability, and vulnerability makes room for love. That patient had once worried about whether they had done enough in life. I remember a conversation from days before the final hour. They asked quietly, did I make a difference? It's a question I hear often. I didn't answer for the family. I let them answer one by one. They did. They spoke about sacrifices that had gone unnoticed, about support that had felt steady and constant, about laughter during difficult seasons. As they spoke, the patient listened, really listened, and I watched something settle inside them. By the time that final hour arrived, there was less tension in their face, less searching in their eyes. The question of did I matter had been met with stories, with tears, with gratitude. Love answered the question. In hospice, I've come to believe that love is the final language most people understand. Even when memory fades, even when words become tangled, a gentle touch can still reach someone. A familiar voice can still calm a restless body. There are moments when a patient hasn't opened their eyes all day, but when a spouse begins to speak, their breathing changes. It steadies, as if some deep part of them recognizes that sound and feels safe. Safety is love in action. When the patient smiled in that final hour, I don't think they were thinking about their resume or the things they wish they had done differently. I think they were feeling the hands that held theirs, hearing the quiet promises in the room, sensing that their life had created connection, and connection is what remains. After a person takes their last breath, the room doesn't empty immediately. People linger, they cry, they hold each other, they tell stories. And in those stories, the person is still present. Their laugh is remembered, their habits are repeated, their phrases are quoted. Love outlives the body. That's something I witness over and over again. The body grows still, but the love continues moving through the room. It shifts from being shared physically to being carried internally, in memories, in gestures, in traditions that get passed down without anyone even realizing it. Near the end, many people seem to sense that. They understand that while the cannot control what happens next, they have already planted something lasting in the hearts of others. That understanding can soften even the hearts of others. That understanding can soften even the hardest goodbye. I've seen people take their final breath with tension in their jaw, and I've seen others with that same gentle curve of a smile. The difference often comes down to whether they feel connected, whether they believe their love was received. The patient who smiled knew in that quiet that their love had somewhere to go. It was already living in the people around the bed. And when someone knows that, success feels smaller, regret feels lighter, love feels enough.